So let me first introduce Kristen. I mean, I guess we could call you Dr. Allott if you really
Yeah, that would be so boring.
But yes. So my first introduction to Kristen was she was teaching a course about mental health assessments through like a functional medicine lens. And oh my gosh, she was such a breath of fresh air. So our profession tends to be very restrictive. And you were speaking about the importance of food in the mental health world. And yet there wasn't even a hint of restriction or deprivation. And what sealed the deal was when a fellow ND said, well, Kristen, what do you think about dairy? And you said, oh my God, I love it. And then another one said, you know, do you recommend eliminating coffee? And you said, oh my God, I hope not. You know, and I thought, oh, I have to get to know this woman because we will be friends.
Yes, and we are. Like you reached out, and I was just like, oh, another naturopath who like really wants to help the whole person.
Right.
Right. Yeah. Not one aspect of ourselves, but the whole person.
Yes. Yay. So today I'm bringing Kristen to you so that we can talk about this controversial topic of carbs and, if we have time, fasting. Because, I mean, you know my opinions on it, but I don't know. People probably get tired of always hearing my opinions on it. And you are not like a badge-wearing health at every size intuitive eating ND. You are.
I respect it, but it's not my skill set.
And that, I think, is part of why I wanted to bring you on, because I think sometimes people think, yeah, but Carrie, you just keep bringing people that are always looking through this lens. And so now I get to bring someone who is not always looking through that lens. And yet the more we converse and the more we talk, you use that lens. You just have never labeled it that way before.
True.
So I don't even know where to start. I mean,
yeah. So you've given me a couple little seeds, and I just want to draw out like why did I come up with the same, like depriving people of what they love? Why that's a bad idea.
Yes.
So I draw on two experience bases. Three really. So Chinese medicine. I'm an acupuncturist. Chinese medicine is 2,000-year-old history, and they don't talk about restricting food at all. Yeah. They talk about honoring how food makes you feel, right? And honoring the context in which you're living in, right? Like, and everything is contextual for them.
Yeah.
And I can talk for an hour, but I'm going to leave it at that. You know, and just to give an example, if you are in a very stressful situation, your brain is going to need carbohydrates. We know that from a medical neurophysiology perspective, but that is also from a Chinese perspective, a lot of the complex carbs, because they didn't have refined carbs really, like even their rice wasn't refined to the degree it is, but the complex carbs, they were like, if you are under stress and you have to do a lot of sorting of information, gourds are going to be a great idea for you, right? Rice is going to be a great idea for you, which are the carbs, right? Yeah. So the other context that I practice from is an addiction perspective. And what we know from economic, not mental health, but economic neurophysiology is depriving the brain. The brain notices when it's deprived. Right? And it doesn't do no very well.
Not really. No.
Not really.
No.
And the example that I give people all the time is I want you to imagine not putting your hand on a hot stove. We all just imagine putting our hand on a hot stove and being like, that was a dumb idea, right? Even in our imagination, right? Like our brain can't it takes an enormous amount of energy to not do a knot. And so if somebody's in recovery for any substance or behavior, they have one thing to avoid. And if I add on a whole list of my naturopathic, don't eat wheat, dairy, corn, eggs, sugar, soy, take away all your favorite foods, guess what? You're going to go back to your substance because it solves a lot of problems, right? And then there's just our prefrontal cortex, which is our responsive brain, where willpower actually comes from. Like, we have studies that willpower is a function of when was the last time you got carbs.
That's amazing to think of that.
So yeah, you can live life without carbs, but that was a famine state.
Yeah.
That was a survival state.
I think that's the part that I find so frustrating about our current trends and fads. That's a whole other thing of what we define as fads. But anyways, we'll park that. So just put a pin in that one. But it's that we have decided that putting our bodies into our backups is a good thing to do. Like, it's like me deciding and choosing to turn the power off in my house and running it on a generator and deciding that that's best for my house.
That's a great example, right?
Like, are you kidding? I couldn't do this. There's so many things, like, systems are going to go offline because there just isn't enough power, right?
Yeah. Right.
And yet we have decided right now that this is the right thing to do. Like,
yeah.
Why? Like, we have those so that we don't die, not to try and be that way all the time. And this carb restriction thing has never worked. I mean, it's not new, this advice. It's just the current, it's made its way back to the front of the conversation again. Sure. Yeah. So in your book, which I'll just
yay.
In your book, there's a few things I love, and probably one of the first things is that you have a whole section that's experiments. They're experiments, and that whole just sense of let's maintain a level of curiosity and play around with stuff and see what happens, instead of this dogmatic following of, if you experience anxiety, you must eat this way, and here's how it goes, full stop, right? Because then that just brings out the part of us saying, you're funny, Kristen, I'm not doing that. Right. That's the one thing that I love. But then you also go through a wonderful explanation about what happens when we get really hungry and when we don't have any carbs.
Yeah.
Can you share like a mini version of that?
Sure. So one of the things that people don't recognize is that, like, our brain, it is dependent upon our body for fuel, right? Like, it doesn't have its own independent fuel source, right? And its primary fuel source is glucose, right? And so when we go more than about 5 hours without food, there's a whole, and it depends on our age, genetics, and how much we exercise, and a whole bunch of variables, but somewhere between 2 and 5 hours, our brain's like, wow, like, it's helpful to be in our prefrontal cortex, our responsive brain, because, like, there's a lot going on. We got emails and we need to be in the present moment. And we need to not be in survival mode. And, like, survival mode is not, Microsoft, the world's coming to an end because I got to get this email out. Survival mode is, there is a bear that's about to kill you. Survival mode. Right? Those are our two brains, right? Like, actually death and behave as though actual death, or responsive. That's what we got. And so we're in our prefrontal cortex, and it's like, well, okay, our fuel's starting to get low. The first signal that's going to come is the food. The brain's like, hey, remember, there's this yummy thing over there. Go get it for me.
Yes, we talk about intrusive food thoughts. Yeah.
Right? Like the first, you starts thinking about food and what you've trained, and you're probably more articulate, but like whatever you've trained your body to go talk to you about, like, like it's going to be like, go get that thing. Right. And so for me, it's chocolate. Like, hey, like we can imagine what the chocolate drawer looks like. Right. Like, oh, right.
Yeah.
So that's the first signal, is like, is you start thinking about food and then you start feeling hungry, but a lot of people are too busy and hyper focused to actually get that signal. It's not a very loud signal until you slow down at the end of the day and have nothing better to do, and then it'll come up and eat you and make you eat lots. But we're going to stay in the day. So then you get hungry, you might get thirsty, then and these aren't necessarily, at this point, it varies a little on order, but there's a constellation of symptoms so fatigue can come up. So anxiety and irritation come up, and I'll explain that physiology and why that comes up, because there's some neurophysiology, but anxiety, irritation comes up. So fatigue, anxiety, irritation comes up. And then you're no longer hungry. Like when you're deprived of food, you eventually become not hungry. Not everybody, but most people, not hungry. And in fact, slightly nauseous. Then you start to get into cognitive problems where you're like, I can't really think. And, and some people start to shake, and you start getting into physical symptoms, right? So you should know your list. Like, everybody should know their list.
Yeah.
So let's talk about what the physiology of that is. Okay, so we're going along, we're having our day, we're multitasking, we're doing meetings, we're on Zoom and meeting and doing something else, and the kids are in the background, right? All these things are going on. And we're like, oh, food. Oh, no, we're not doing food. Oh, hungry. Like, I'm going to drink some water, I'm going to ignore it. Then when your brain's like, wow, we do not have enough fuel, we are going to send a signal down to the liver to make fuel. And a whole bunch of hormones start to get released for that. I'm not going to go through all of them, but the two primary ones are glucagon, which says to the liver, make glucose for me. So, to the question of depriving yourself of glucose, it's not like you don't have glucose. Your body will make glucose for you, but it's from you. It's going to make you into glucose, right? So we'll talk about that. So glucagon, and then adrenaline, norepinephrine and epinephrine. So if you had a really normal childhood and your life has always been safe and wonderful, and you've had really, great attachments to people, and you know how to set boundaries, and you can read your emotions and be like, oh, I'm noticing the wind is changing directions, and I wonder what that's about. Oh, I know what that's about. Like, if you have all those skill sets, you can probably go a pretty long time without eating. But if you have a history of trauma, a history of being deprived, any survival things in that lizard brain, when adrenaline hits in the system, your sensory input goes from your brain, your senses, instead of to your prefrontal cortex, to your lizard brain. And whatever's back there gets pulled up of like, oh my God, there's a bear in the room, or my abuser's in the room, or my crazy mom's in the room, or my alcoholic uncle's in the room, or whatever, even though they're not. Like, all those reactions. And so the anxiety and irritation come up because there's adrenaline in the system, right? And so I personally want to avoid that, because it's really hard to track. Like, I'm a martial artist. I've done martial arts for 22 years. When Joey comes at me with a stick, I have adrenaline in my system. In fact, I have adrenaline in my system before I even get to the dojo because I know what's going to happen.
Because you know someone's coming at you with a stick.
Yeah. Oh, I'm training with Joey today with a stick. He has never actually hurt me, but like my survival brain did not wire that in after 22 years. But if I get an adrenaline release and I'm sitting in my bedroom and there's nothing scary going on and I am getting worked up with anxiety and irritation, I will create a story for why that's happening. I will label a story why that happens. And God forbid the person who comes through the door to have a normal conversation with me, they're going to get my lizard brain. And it's going to be not the curious, engaged, compassionate conversation that I would probably like to have, particularly if it's with an adolescent. Just saying, right?
They have a special way, don't they?
Because our adolescents were challenging. And so our adolescent record comes up and their adolescent is right there actually. And then you have these two non-formed adult brains. It's very ugly. Anyway, so let's talk about what happens in your body to get glucose. Is your liver converts protein, which is ultimately coming from your protein storage unit, which is called muscle, into glucose.
And that's like, I just want to pause to really bring that forward, because in the research that I have read about any of the longer studies on intermittent fasting is that people have less lean muscle mass because of this happening, right? Our bodies will take it from our muscles if we don't put it in our mouths.
Right. And what I've seen from the research, because people are like, but I want my body to burn fat, because when we're talking about intermittent fasting, usually there is a conversation about some body shape. And I was like, well, the studies show that you actually have to be calorie restricted for 3 weeks before your body's going to tap into your fat stores.
Imagine how much muscle you're going to use up in those 3 weeks.
Right? And so this is, for me, what explains why quick weight loss program, we lose weight, right? It's just weight, which is why BMI is a basically meaningless index for me, right?
It should be for all, but that's another rant for another day.
Right. But our weight, like if you're going to get on a scale, please get on a scale that has some other metric like muscle mass and fat percentage. Like, and don't get on a scale. I'm not advocating for that. But if you're going to get on a scale, get on a smarter scale that is at least giving you some metrics on what's happening in your body.
And what's interesting is after all of that, our body will preferentially store fat over the production of muscle or other things.
Right, because we have reduced our metabolic rate because we have taken the muscle mass off.
Yeah.
Right. And so I went to a lecture on, and they studied a group of people, height, weight, proportional and rounder people, and had them on a calorie restricted diet. And they were going to lose 10% of their body mass and see if they had more activities of daily living. Right. And what they found is both groups had less activities of daily living. And what was shocking to me is like the researcher laid out like they knew they were taking off muscle mass, right? Like she laid out all that physiology, like that was at the beginning of the lecture. And I raised my hand and I was like, well, you thought that the rounder people were going to have more activities of daily living, which would then help them burn more calories, right? That was the experiment, but that they actually did more or less activities of daily living than the other group of people, the control group. And it was like, well, why do you think that is?
Because they're hungry.
And she and she, because I mean, and it was kind of a bait, but I wanted to see if she agreed with my hypothesis, which was they are doing less activities of daily living because they have significantly less muscle mass, and so it's more tiring to do activities of daily living. And she said, well, I think they're lazy.
Of course.
And I was just like, oh, you should not be doing this research. But like, we can't, and I bring that up because we don't respect the physiology.
Agreed.
Right. And that's why I come to similar conclusions as you do, not because I inherently believe in the philosophy. I do. I am really about respecting the physiology.
And that, I think, is like, so I recently attended a webinar for dietitians, and the woman was talking about weight loss medications and why we should be using them more. And thankfully, I'm far enough on my own journey to like attend these things, because I just like them to give me the numbers that I can show people of why they suck. But they went through, same deal, all the physiology, explained all the reasons why sustained weight loss is just not possible, how we've completely foobarred our metabolisms and made a mess of things, and this is why, and all the stuff that happens, and and then they say, and this is why we need the medications to bypass, all of the hunger stuff so that you can stay on the lower calorie diets. That's the goal. And I was like, right. And then again, me being me, ask like, what's the long term? Like, show me the 5-year. And every graph that went past that first 6 to 12 months, there was a start to see an increase in weight. And when I'd ask about that, because my hypothesis and theory is that the body just took a little bit longer to figure out how to bypass even the medications. And their philosophy and hypothesis is that the patient just decided to eat like shit again, and that's why they're getting fat again. And I'm like,
it's not that we aren't honoring the physiology, it's that they're doing something wrong.
Yeah. And this constant blame landing, like anyways, I can climb on that high horse and stay there for hours. But yeah, you made a couple of points that I wanted to circle back to. And the one actually was, and I shared it on social media, but in case people didn't see it, was the last time we spoke, you were talking about a study about judges and what happened when they were hungry versus not.
Oh yeah.
Yes. I think highlights how our lives occur and how we experience our world when we're honoring our hunger versus when we're not.
Right. So I like digging around the literature, and because it's the literature I like to look at is actually decision making, like what influences our decision making, because that's how we get hired. Right? Like, because if you don't need human decision making, a computer will do it for you. So like, let's be clear who we're competing against, not other humans, computers. So we better know how our brain and physiology work. So I found this study. So the problem with just a little bit on the literature, the problem with literature around decision making is it's often with college students. And so the pushback is, well, it's not a fully formed brain. It's, it's a semi-adolescent brain, right? And so, okay, fine. So they went and they found a whole group of judges. So they college degree and then graduate degree and then lawyer and then judge, right? So highly educated. And their only purpose in life is to render decisions, right? Like that's their job, right? So this group of judges are reading files for parole, right? And all they're doing is saying, no, you get to stay in jail for another year. Yes, you get to go into the pile and be considered for parole. So no one's actually getting out. It's just, will you be considered, right? And they knew they were in a study. They thought they were an implicit bias study. And so they're probably all being really careful about race and gender and all of those things that we infer with implicit bias. That wasn't really the study. The study was, they make different decisions based on the time away from a meal? So the files that got reviewed an hour after a meal, so right after breakfast, right after lunch, 65% were considered for parole. That's pretty good, right? Like, yeah, it looks like you're doing a good job. Thank you so much for trying hard. Like, no, you don't need to stay for whatever misdemeanor you're here. Like, we'll let you out early. Immediately before a meal, like the hour before the meal, how many people were considered for parole? So if you're listening to this, I just want you to think into your head, because I just want to pause long enough for you to be like, and when I do this public speaking, I hear 40%, 20%, 10%, like, little popcorn of percentages. No one ever says zero. Nobody is considered for parole right before a meal.
So when the judges have been reviewing files, reviewing cases, been sitting there, they're starting to get hungry, they're moving out of their prefrontal cortex into their lizard brain, and by the time they're ready to eat again, nobody is considered for parole.
No one is considered for parole. And if you ask them, like, are you anxious? Are you irritated? How are you doing? They'd be like, I'm fine. It's just that the information that's going into their brain has already shifted, and they're not even aware of it. Yeah. Right? Not even aware of it. There's a new book by Daniel Kahneman, who's an award-winning economist who wrote Fast and Slow Thinking. And he came out with a book called Noise, which shows how bad we are at making decisions. Right across the board, and the variation in the number of parameters in which will shift our decision making. Okay, so we can accept that we're all bad decision makers, right? But and intermittent decision makers, we make different decisions on the same information all the time. But there are things that we can do to be aware of that, and there are things that we can do in our lives that make it harder to make those decisions, right? And so I want to tell the story of the executive that I work with.
Sure. Yeah.
As an example.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So I was working with this pretty high, I'm in Seattle, so like there's a lot of Microsoft, Amazon, pretty high level executives, important people making important amounts of money, right? An executive coach called me and was like, hey, you need to see this person because he's about to quit his job. And I was like, okay, so why am I seeing? And they're like, well, I want you to listen to what's going on. And so he comes in, and I'm like, what's going on? And he's like, when I take breaks, I go to the bathroom and I want to cry. And like, for a guy to admit that he wants to cry, right? Like, that's kind of a big deal. And I was like, well, what's going on at work? Well, we have this big thing and it's really, important and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, is this a higher level of stress? He's like, no, I've done lots of this. And I really like doing this. And I like the project and I like the people. And I was like, so what's happening at home? It's fine. And I'm like, okay, so you're not going to give me anything emotional. That's going to like, I get it. Okay. I'm like, so let's just start with, what are you eating? And he was like, well, so for breakfast, I have this protein bar. It's high protein, no carbs, super sweet, sweetened by sugar alcohols. Have that for lunch. And because I have dinner at work, I have a Caesar salad with chicken or salmon. And I was like, so when you're having so much, so let's think about the physiology, because we're just talking about the physiology, right? So he's having salmon, he was having croutons, salmon croutons, salad, big salad, doesn't drink in the evenings. That's dinner. And then he goes, and that's about 6 o'clock. So 6 o'clock, 6 a.m., that's 12 hours. And then he has a protein bar that tastes like sugar, smells like sugar, isn't sugar, but is protein. And then his body needs to make carbohydrates so his prefrontal cortex can work, and is releasing the adrenaline because he goes to work about 9 o'clock, and by 10 o'clock he's on the verge of tears because his prefrontal cortex is wanting more fuel. He's only in his lizard brain. I don't know what's down there, and he's not going to tell me. Right? But it's making him upset enough, and it's disturbing him enough that his solution is to leave a job that he reports loving. And I'm like, well, why are you just eating these protein bars for breakfast and lunch? And he's like, well, because as soon as this project's over, we're going to island with beaches, and I want to, and I want to look a little better than I do because I'm not, 20 anymore. And right. And I was just like, okay, let's do an experiment. I want you to eat a Cliff Bar. I like Cliff Bars because it's kind of a good carb to protein ratio. Cliff, because he's busy, right? And I've got 2 appointments before he quits this important job.
Right.
So I'm like, Cliff Bar for breakfast and lunch. And by the way, you can't lose weight during stress. So like, we can have a conversation about that later, but like, you're not going to lose weight. I'm just trying to quit the crying. Like, I don't care if you cry, but you're asking me to stop that from happening. And so that was Monday. We had a Wednesday appointment. At the end of Tuesday, he calls. He's like, I don't have time to come see you. The protein bar, the Cliff Bars are awesome. Thank you so much. I'm not going to quit my job. But like, nowhere did he ask the question, am I having a hard time because of how I've changed my diet?
Because I think so often we just assume that the changes in our diet is going to produce good things, right? Oh, we're restricting carbs, that's good. We're restricting anything, that's good. We are going to feel better.
Right.
Even just the justifications of like, oh, I've started listening a little bit more and reading a little bit more about some of the keto stuff. And like, their bodies are screaming with everything they have, please stop doing this, where they're like sick. And the encouragement is to just push through.
Yeah.
God, please stop. Your body, everything in it is saying this is not good. Please stop doing this, but we push through. But I love that story because it just really highlights the importance of having those carbs and having those pieces so that we can function properly, that we can think properly. The other thing I made note of was when you were talking about the judges and even this gentleman, like they're completely unaware that it's hunger. Like,
right.
Like it is not registering at all that they
Right.
might be irritated or frustrated or hungry. And so when I'm working with people, one of the very first things I give them is the hunger discovery scale. And I say, just spend between now and next visit noticing how hungry are you when you eat? How full are you when you stop? And people I've been working with for years are like, I still don't have a freaking clue. I have to be absolutely starving before I become aware. I'm like,
Right.
yes. And and this is why, like, we have broken our meters to the point where we can't hear it. And for a lot of people, they never can. And they do end up on a bit of a schedule of eating, which feels kind of diety to them. But then I try and explain what you've so eloquently explained of, no, this is about making sure that you are nourishing your body with adequate nutrients so that you can function.
Yeah.
And I work with a
Recent,
lot of people who don't want to binge. I mean, that's how I got into all this. Kristen, my only goal was to stop binge eating.
yeah.
That was all. I didn't know I was getting into a social justice movement. I didn't like, I just wanted to stop eating all the things.
Yeah.
And it was so disruptive to my thought
Yeah.
patterns that I had to stop restricting in order to stop binging.
Right. Right. Yeah, absolutely. I see that all the time.
Frustrating.
Yeah.
Because the solution is always, we'll just eat less of the thing, just restrict more.
Yeah. Yeah. So to the piece about having a schedule and that feeling a little diety, I recently, about 6 months ago, my stepdaughter had her first child, and so we do a little bit of babysitting, and so I've been watching this, lovely little girl spend the last 6 months trying to figure out how to move her hand, right?
Yeah.
Like move, and she still doesn't, she's got a lot more control, but move her hand, right? And I'm watching how much, and that's all she does all day long. Like that is her full-time job, is to figure out how to get control of her body.
Yeah.
Right. And we spend 2 weeks and we're like, why don't we have it? Right.
Yeah.
And when I teach in addiction groups, I do a timeline on like how long do you expect to, what does each moment look like, right? From the first month to the first year. And I think that it applies because it's a neurological, it doesn't matter if it's addiction or it's food, but like it's the first year you do it, the second year you get it, the third year it's going to get a little more automated, and you got to kind of stick at it for about 5 years before it's like hardwired in.
Yeah.
Does that mean you're going to slip up? No, of course you're going to slip up. Like everybody slips up, right? But this idea that, because it like takes 5 years to get a PhD, like whenever we look at deep learning, right? And at least the people that I work with who have sort of disordered kind of eating patterns, like I have a handout called the Autobiography of the Body. Like, like think about what, or ask your parents, like, did they feed you on a schedule? Was food predictable when you had no control over that? Like when you were supposed to get these skills, right? Like, did you get them? Did you have somebody help you get them? I've had a number of parents or clients who had really horrible parents when they were young, but I also have where the parents kind of disappeared when they turned to 10, 11, 12, when they are starting to automate that.
Right.
And so like if you didn't have good support and good role modeling for those 18 years, it might take more than a month.
Well, and I think especially now, like I'm watching people so like my mom dieted her whole life.
Yeah.
Her mother watched her weight and dieted her whole life. I'm pretty sure great grandma did too. It's just been sort of passed along. And then now we have this like wellness culture that's like, it's even more confusing and compounding all of this, right? And so we have people who have absolutely no basic understanding of their own relationship with food and stuff. They don't know what to eat intuitively. They have no idea what things feel like, what hunger feels like, until they're absolutely starving. They've had all these rules their whole lives, and now they're having babies.
Yeah.
And they're coming and they're going, Carrie, I don't have a clue. I have no idea what I should be doing here. Like, should it be a schedule? Should they be allowed to eat when they want? My mother's telling me the baby's too fat and I should be restricting, and holy cow, right? I mean, it's so overwhelming, and simple things like celebrating with a birthday cake are not part of many children's childhoods right now, because sugar is the demon of all carbs. It's so layered and complex, and it just breaks my heart.
Yeah.
Yeah, it totally breaks my heart. But yeah, it's going to take time.
Yeah.
We have to learn these things, have this expectation of just knowing things, and we're supposed to get
Right.
it right off the top.
Right. And so the question that I'm always seeking for people is like, what is best for you? Right?
Yeah.
What is best for you in this moment, at the age, at the family dynamics, at the, like, because it changes from decade to decade and moment to moment and, lifestyle to lifestyle. And so it's just not a box that you can check off.
And it's ever evolving. I mean, I started practicing intuitive eating. So Patrick just turned 13, which I don't know how I have a teenager, but anyways, how did that happen? But when he was a baby was when I had a relapse with the binge eating. And a big part of that was the lack of sleep and the fear of weight gain, and like all the bits, right? Very complicated time of my life.
Yeah.
And so I went to Overeaters Anonymous because I thought, well, surely I'm a food addict. That explains everything. It does not.
Sure.
And then once I realized that was not the answer, then I went to the intuitive eating stuff and found, I was like, oh, right, that was just a diet by a different name. Because again, the focus was restriction. The focus was, it was outside of me, right?
Yeah.
That there was some substance and thing that if I just got my shit together, that it would be okay. Absolutely not the answer, right? But then through that, it was just this evolution, and it continues to evolve,
Right.
So here I am out, well, a decade out the other side of starting to unravel this stuff, and I'm still like, would you look at that?
Right.
But there isn't the pressure to do it right anymore. I'm far enough past that, and I think we see that in education too. I mean, the more you learn, the more you know you don't know. And we're okay with not knowing.
Right.
But in that beginning part, we think that we know and we should know, and then finally we get that tipping point where we're just gonna experiment. We're gonna see what works. We're gonna play with this and see what happens. I'm mindful of the time, because I know when I look at a video and see that it's more than an hour, I'm like, I don't have time to watch that.
Exactly.
I don't want to put people in that position, because I think you've ticked most of the boxes of what I really wanted my audience to understand. It's just that carbs are an essential, glucose is required for our brain to work, and it will get it no matter what you do.
Yep.
So preferably let's feed it as opposed to it taking it. And that prolonged periods of time without food has a major impact on our ability to function and make decisions and relate to other people and be in our lives.
Absolutely.
Is that a
That's
decent
a
summary?
really great summary.
Yes. Nailed it. See, I was paying attention and everything.
Yeah.
I did get a Cliff Bar in me right before we started, because I looked at the clock and went, oh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I got a handful of nuts and a handful of cherries. Dried cherries.
Yeah, whatever needs to go. So thank you for spending time with us. I feel like you and I could probably just talk every week.
Yeah, that would be so fun.
You to have amazing conversations and bring up some really good stuff. I'm going to let people know how they can follow you and find you.
Mostly Protein for All is where you can find us. Protein for All on Instagram and Facebook and YouTube.
Perfect. And then, if questions pop up, then we'll get them to you one way or another. And we'll do this again very soon.
Yay! This is very fun. Thank you very much.
Kristen.